CMMS Radio talks about all things CMMS, computerized maintenance management software, focused on maintenance management. It's the people, the process, and the culture that make your CMMS journey a success. Welcome back to CMMS Radio. Thank you for tuning in. We're joined again today by the one and only George Williams, ReliabilityX. George, welcome back to CMMS Radio.
Greg, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
The best thing about when you and I talk, George, is we're pretty damn open and straightforward. And I think that helps people. So for anybody that gets offended by anything that we say, not sorry.
Not even a little.
I wanted to just connect today. It's Thanksgiving week. First of all, thank you for what you do and the fine group of individuals you have at ReliabilityX. And I mean that because the conversations we don't record are very helpful to me to understand how to approach certain situations in maintenance and reliability. I'm not an expert, so I'm lucky to have experts that can tell me straight and not just dance around a bunch of fluffy, buzzy crap. And I like that. So thank you.
Well, we love talking to you.
First question, and just, no wrong answers here. You just knock them down as they come. Is AI, artificial intelligence, new?
No, all of my intelligence has been artificial since birth.
What can you tell me about AI, and be as kind as you want to, when it comes to how popularized it is now in this last, I'm going to call it 12 months, but we both know and agree that it's not new, but anything that comes to mind when I say, hey, tell me about this AI, why does everybody think it's a new shiny thing?
Well, I think it will grow into that. I think there is a crossover period where people are labeling things AI where they're still just algorithm based. And it's not truly, I don't want to say computing because that would be algorithm based, but it's not really doing this search across just the entire spectrum of the internet and trying to consolidate information into a thought. Nor is it anticipating your next thought, right? And so I think when we think about artificial intelligence, you've got to be able to anticipate things and do some other stuff. And I think right now there's a lot of the technology is still just Industry 4.0 with a new wrapper on it and called .ai. But it's still not going to break down barriers. Since the first. Since Ford and the assembly line, I don't know, computing and then after computing, nothing has really changed the manufacturing landscape like people think it was supposed to. They thought the same thing about, generalized sensor data. It's going to completely change the way, and then we're still, got OEE at 50 and 60% in our plant, regardless of how many sensors we've put on and how many TV screens we've put above the lines. And I think Industry 4.0 is not much different than that until people realize it's not just the technology, but they have to nurture people and educate people, and that's really what creates success. You're just putting a new shiny wrapper on the same approach or thought process.
So building on that, when we look at, we were just talking about this idea of educating end users and even, operators and those folks when it comes to all these various technologies, methodologies. I mean, look, you've got the brand new framework behind you. Is that where, I don't know if we're going to be right here, but is that where sometimes the organizations that sell these technologies, they're in a hurry, they have to make a number, and they don't have as much time or maybe the visibility or the bandwidth to do the educating?
They're not in the business of educating. They're in the business of sales. So two pieces to that. The person that writes a check is not the operator. And typically the people that write the checks are trying to do everything they can to eliminate operators. So, they're preying on the hierarchy of needs, just like any other good salesperson does, right? So they're going into these organizations and promising them that their cost to operate will get reduced. Their downtime that they think is maintenance related or whatever it may be is going to get reduced, and potentially you'll get rid of headcount, right? Meanwhile, they put in a bunch of robots and they put in a bunch of other stuff. The technical skill set to take care of them skyrockets. They can't find the headcount, so the machine's down. It's not really the outcome they necessarily thought. Does that mean that all implementations fail? By any means, no. But it does require a well laid out plan of how am I going to balance that technology with the people I have and the skill sets I need to hit a successful end result. Is that the path that a salesperson takes you down? Probably not, because that's extra work, right? Buy the shiny thing is faster. It's easier. Hey, this takes away your headaches. We can, give you peace of mind and reduce your cost. And any one of those hierarchy needs that tugs a thread on means a potential sale. So I don't fault the technology companies. They still have a product to sell, just like I do. We've got to sell our services. And so we've got to make sure that we're taking an approach that perks people's ears up. Is it doing the industry any good? It's probably not making it worse.
Okay.
And there can certainly be very successful implementations of technology to improve a plant's performance, without a doubt. But I think that ultimately you still have to have a well-educated shop floor in order to be successful.
I think, well, I certainly agree. And I know there's a lot of directions we could take on this. I think when we talk about, you're talking about, that salesperson, they've got to make their sales. I think there's a lot of them that would like to make that sale with a more long-term goal of retention. And a lot of times I'm coming back to this disruptive aspect of the resources and the spend needed to truly educate the masses, if you will. And they just don't do that, because that return, you can't see it right now. You see it in retrospect with your retention when you make a sale of a piece of technology. It could be CMMS or otherwise. In my world, it's computerized maintenance management software, where you've really, really qualified that you can solve the problem for the client rather than get the client to buy. That little difference there doesn't lend itself well to making quota quickly.
So if you're the business owner, you will always say, I want the long-term partnership. However, we've had conversations in the past where we talk about the generation that's coming in and how they work 3 years in jet. And that's through no fault of their own, because pensions disappeared and all kinds of stuff. If you ask a Gen Zer how long they intend to stay at any company, they're probably going to say less than 5 years, 3 years, whatever. So if that's true, now just hear my thought process here. If that is true, do they give a crap about long-term relationships?
No.
Only maybe if they're going to become a salesperson in the same industry. But if they're going to just completely jump ship and go someplace else, I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there that there could also be this convergence of this generation doesn't expect longevity inside a business. And so if they are in sales, while the mindset is always, I want a long-term partnership, maybe they see that slightly differently today than maybe they did 20 years ago, where you stayed with a company for a really long time. I don't know. I'm not suggesting that that's the case. I'm certainly not suggesting that salespeople don't care about long-term relationships. I find it interesting, though, that outside of sales, we keep having the conversation that people have lost the loyalty to the company, right? And that's because the company lost loyalty to their people and they don't have pensions. I'm not blaming the people. I just find it interesting that if that's true, maybe that's true of, do I care about a long-term relationship from a sales perspective?
Yeah, that's and we're not gonna solve that right here. It's something to think about, and what I like about us talking about it is I think a lot of people are thinking about it, or if they actually
Well,
listen to
they just
this.
leave a comment, right? And then we can learn from that. So, I'm just talking out of my bum here and off the top of my head. So, maybe there's something to it, maybe there's not.
Yeah, I hope anybody out there just get us some feedback some way. Find one of us, tell us, hey, you guys were talking about this. I've got something to say, because that matters more than anything. Hell of a lot more than what you and I say, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
And we mean that as an open invitation to keep conversations going. That's what we're always doing. I mentioned earlier about the framework behind you, so I want to talk about that a little bit. It's been, I hope I can say it this way, wildly successful as it relates to the way everybody has received it and they're so interested in it. Can you share anything about that, like what you're seeing and experiencing since the launch?
I so I haven't checked in a few days, but last I checked, we were at several thousand YouTube views of the launch video. Um, I'm getting a lot of great feedback. We're certainly going to get feedback on things that people want to change.
Hmm.
That's just the nature of the beast when you send something out into the world. And we kind of knew that we weren't going to get it perfect the first time out. We've got the 4,500, just about 4,500 views on YouTube for the introductory video.
Yeah.
Um, we're getting an awful lot of interest in, how can I apply this? And Ramesh and I will be doing a workshop in January. It'll be over several days, but separated. So we'll do a 6-hour session and then give the folks homework, and then they'll come back. We'll do another 6-hour session. And I think there are 4 total 6-hour sessions that'll be part of that. That'll essentially teach you not only everything about the framework, but how to use it to build and implement a strategy. And that's why we built the framework. People read the book all the time, and the feedback that Ramesh always gets and that we get is, well, now what? Like, I've read the book, but how do I implement this? It's 700 pages of best practice. How do I implement this? And so we built the framework so that people could learn exactly how to do that. How do you assess where you're at? How do you develop a sound strategy? How do you communicate it? Because realistically, that's the challenge, right? There's always a million things to get better, but what are the right things to do? And the framework allows a visual representation of assessing where you're at and building a strategy and communicating that strategy. So that's kind of where we're at with that.
Yeah, I think what'll be really interesting about that, and the way you described how you'll do the workshops or mini workshops, when you start to get this feedback and learn about the unique environments where somebody's implementing this, it allows you to further iterate and make refinements and understand more. Um, I want to say industry by industry, but we both know that it's organization by organization. That's the truth.
Yeah. We could put 100 building blocks on the page, probably 200 building blocks, maybe 1,000 building blocks, but it has to be manageable and consumable by the end user. And so, we're at 40, we're going to kind of stick to 40. So if something's coming off the board, getting at it, something needs to come off.
Yeah.
And that's always the challenge, right? We had a lot of internal discussion, particularly with Ramesh regarding what KPIs and measurements and how do we incorporate that. And our thought process is that sits at every one of these blocks. Every one of these blocks needs to be measured if you're going to implement it in terms of its success. And you should know how those measurements tie into your the top layer here, which is competitive advantage. And so when we think about that, we didn't want a building block specific to measurements or performance because we felt that it has to sit everywhere. But we're definitely going to get feedback from people that say, how come I don't see that? So it's a matter of keeping it consolidated enough to consume, still giving enough information, and like work. There's nothing on here that says planning and scheduling. Everything is in the block that says work management. We could probably write 50 books just on the one building block. But we've got to put them someplace, and we wanted to keep it manageable and consumable.
Question for you on that. And by the way, on the video, what was good for me while watching it was each time while both you and Ramesh were talking, he was relating either a segment or a particular block in a segment and how they relate all to one another, which allows you throughout the video to have a relational understanding between the different levels and the blocks themselves within that. I wanted to ask, where within would you say the CMMS, computerized maintenance management software, sits, or does it actually touch all of it?
So within our maintenance management layer is where CMMS sits. So CMMS EAM is one of the building blocks. It sits in the maintenance management layer.
Mm-hmm.
However, one could argue that it spans into the asset management realm because you can build the strategy there. The reason we put it in the maintenance management layer is that in our holistic approach, asset management is the strategy of how I'm going to execute everything. The CMMS houses the individual asset strategy. That's maintenance management. It houses the execution in the storeroom spare parts. That's maintenance management. So for us, that's where we felt it to be the more appropriate location. But it's certainly a critical cornerstone of getting all of this execution finished. When we think about the different layers for us, leadership and culture being at the bottom, you just fail miserably without either of those. But we've got essentially from top down, you've got the competitive advantage, the things that you expect as outcomes of all of this work. Below that is asset management. How do I translate that to a strategy of taking care of our assets, where the strategy of how we manage the assets has to outcome competitive advantage? The next two layers, both maintenance management and operational reliability, are how do I execute at the asset level, the asset strategy, the asset management in order to achieve those objectives. So there's this line of sight that's consistent throughout. And then that culture and leadership is how do I manage the people to execute against my assets, the strategy I have for my assets in order to achieve my competitive advantage. And so if you just think of it in those terms, there's this direct line of sight between any of the blocks, and it's direct link to competitive advantage.
It's and there's so much more to unpack. I just wanted to get a little kind of flavoring of it, and because we're doing kind of a short impromptu episode for everybody. I hit George up. I'm like, hey, you got some time today? Let's catch up real quick, and we decided to record after a nice conversation. I want to switch gears a little bit then, moving away from this, and I want to talk about something we were talking about earlier when we weren't recording. Can you tell me a little bit about what is the Ozzy paradox?
The Ozzy paradox. Yes. So as you know, I teach a course in CMMS setup and utilization. And one of the things that you and I talk about often is how there's so much variation between different systems and how they execute similar tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Why some systems need an asset template where other systems have fields already baked in to house certain information. Why some of them need master PMs and some of them don't. Why some of them have location records and some of them don't. And why all this happens. And I decided to to create examples in that course that kind of show that, explain that a little bit. So the after we the course starts off with teaching people about basics of a database, right? Basics of what they see as a user on the screen versus what sits inside the database, fields and relationships and all kinds of stuff. Field labels versus what the table might say something is called, all kinds of different things. Once we go through those basic terminologies, I have them split up into groups, and they have to create a database on paper or in Excel, really basic, on how to manage their record collection. And so they'll go off into their teams, and people will say, okay, I need a band name, I need a year, I need an album. I want the year the band was formed. I want to know, the lead singer or whatever the case may be. I want to know if the, album won an award. Did it win a Grammy? All kinds of things. And so they start building this database. And then we start figuring out, well, what would have to be related tables? Like you might want the company that produced the album. So that would be a list, a value list to select from. Was it Sony? Was it RCA? Who was the company that produced the album? So we start teaching them about those relationships. And then we go back to the class and we learn a bunch of other functionality that sits inside of a CMMS. And the second exercise, I give them a challenge. I say, okay, it was great. You guys all built this record collection. I want you to deal with Ozzy Osbourne. And I could have picked, a million other characters in the industry, but he was in a band. He maybe more than one. He had a solo career. He's been a featured singer on many, many songs. He has duets. And so you've got many categories of music in which he would have to be listed. And I want to be able to see, if I select Ozzy Osbourne, I want to see it all. I want to see the work he did with Lita Ford and the work he did in Black Sabbath and the stuff in his solo career. And I want to see everything, right? Guest appearances, whatever the case may be. And so they now have to go back and figure out how to solution that in a database they already created. And some of them may have made it album centric. Some of them may have made the database song centric. Some of them may have made it band centric. And so they all have to now figure out in how they've structured it to solution that. So the Ozzy paradox is inside us in any database, but we'll just use CMMS as an example. The person who initially created the database had this thought process of how it was going to be structured. And then some idiot user gave them a requirement like me. And they had to then accommodate that in the structure they already created without having to undo everything. And so a CMMS is a collection of requirements that came, a central core idea and a series of requirements that came afterwards, figured out how to solution outside of the core idea. And that kind of explains why those systems vary so much. And for me, I just call that the Ozzy paradox.
Well, the reason I wanted to have you explain it instead of trying to do it myself is I still kind of want to take it in because I might get the point, but it's really interesting because in this world of CMMS, there's so many of them. Why? Well, this is one way to kind of attempt to understand that. Now, once we understand that, then what do we do? And this is the problem everybody wrestles with. And then I want to change it up a little bit. So now we know what the Ozzy paradox is. When we have a CMMS in place and we're successful in our environment, our respective organization at this particular plant, maybe it's multiple plants, we've finally gotten where we're getting results. We're getting outcomes because we're also getting inputs, which means we've got frontline and operator adoption, utilization. And without that, we don't get much of an outcome, if any. But now, what can also happen, much like Ozzy, okay, he's with, Black Sabbath, but then now it's a solo career. Sometimes the person or the people that made that happen with their CMMS, they might go join another band.
Yep.
And now you've got a disruption in your process that has been well adopted. It seems to me, and the question I'm really getting at here is that's far more common than the CMMS that you have not working. It's that the people or the person that understood it is not there anymore. And that can very quickly, even in a matter of days, cause the exact opposite of the thriving you've had on the CMMS. Is that a really common thing in your experiences over all these years?
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. And it boils down to the balance between people, processes, and systems. CMMS being, in this case, a system.
Mm-hmm.
Systems can mean a lot more than just electronic ones, but we'll say the CMMS is a system. You then have people, and you've got process. And if I have a good system and good process and I ignore the people, I just have failure. If I have good processes and good people, but my system is shit, then I have frustration. I get frustrated people. They're good, they're talented, they know what to do, they have a process, but the system doesn't support them, so they're frustrated. If I have good systems and I have good people, but I lack process, then I am talent reliant. That means if I have people that create their own process, then I can be successful. But the second I promote them or they leave, I have to reinvent the process because I lack a documented process and a standard and an expectation of that standard be followed. And so if I have a phenomenal admin and that individual, she or he drives everybody to use the system, which happens way often, fantastic. But I can't promote that person because if I do, it all falls apart. What tends to happen is we get the system in place, but we don't build the process around it. We cut the project off before then, it runs out of money, whatever the case may be, but we don't truly build a standard expectation of how to use the system and train people to it and teach them that the process matters, not just the system. And so, oftentimes we'll say within the use of the CMMS, we are talent reliant to how good the admin drives that behavior.
So that becomes your constraint.
Yes.
So now I myself have often thought when somebody gets the CMMS and starts implementing the CMMS and starts adopting the CMMS that it should be documented the whole way through, further refined, and regularly updated so that everyone has something in the form of a document to which they may refer when we have this kind of a disruption or that administrator, let's pretend they win the lottery, we hope, and they go travel the world for the rest of their life. They're not going to take your calls and say, oh, yeah, let me help you with that. But the documentation of it and the refining of that documentation, A, often doesn't happen or happen well. And B, it will eventually move out of the purview of the people it matters to most because they're too busy with all the primary objectives. So I just keep wondering, and this is always going to be a theme of CMMS Radio, how on earth do we change that? Or is it going to change very slowly? It's never going to change long term, and we just have to keep shouting about it.
Well, unfortunately, you're not going to change it through the sale of the CMMS. It's too competitive of a market for them to build in the process building. And they can't create the organizational discipline for you to follow that process. So we have to educate businesses around the necessity of that in order to get the value from the CMMS. when an organization reaches out to a bunch of CMMS companies and tries to engage them for potential business, they're not probably saying to them, or not typically, I've certainly heard of cases of this, where they want you to revamp all their processes in addition to implementing the CMMS. So because of that, it's now a competitive market on the software, right? As a whole, install this, right? Or give me access to it in today's world in exchange for some dollar amount. And so there's nothing in there around, I mean, maybe I need to know your process to fill out some value lists, but I'm not making sure you follow a process at that price point. So that has to be something that inherently the organization learns is valuable, either through failure of previous CMMS systems, or they happen to just be lucky enough to listen to your podcast and learn a thing or two about how the CMMS as itself in isolation has no value. It has no value. It is useless. In and of itself, it's useless. If you want value from it, you have to populate it. And you've got to put it to use. Much like my record collection database. Well, if it's just for reference only, it didn't serve me any purpose. If what I can do is track the songs I listen to the most, and for whatever reason that becomes valuable to me, and I make decisions based on that, and I create playlists based on that, and I can automate the creation of playlists based on that, then I've got some value from my database. If all I'm going to do is occasionally look something up, I can write that on paper. So, you've got to be able to get value from it. And the transition period between the sale of the electronic system and the value I receive is not always a short-term thing, especially if you're coming from, I don't have anything, and now I'm going to have a CMMS. So, the leadership of those companies has to be educated in the necessity of clean, sound process, because otherwise they're, let's say they went from nothing to I have a CMMS, and then 5 years later, I want to see the data. If they didn't build the process up front, they're not going to realize they have useless data until that 5th year. Then they find out they should have had process. They'll blame the CMMS vendor, kick them out, and go to another one, and it had nothing to do with the CMMS, right? So, there is some value to the service provider offering that service, but it is definitely a hard sell when you're competing against a bunch of other companies that may not be saying that's a necessity.
Right. And I'll add to that as kind of a closing thing. I'm not trying to be dogmatic about it, but I think a certain amount of this is incumbent upon the CMMS providers to have something in place that adds in that protection layer for the client. And a lot of them, even in my life in the industry, hey, we're going to check on you because we're not going to assume that no news is good news. And we would, but then they're busy doing all their stuff. So even if you have, some processes in place to help them manage or back manage how they're using and monitoring their CMMS, it's not a pure fail-safe. It's just a potential stopgap. And I think we just have to keep talking about this and reintroducing this same strategy in different ways that resonates with different people. And even to be fair to leadership, it's really hard for them to know everything about what they're responsible for, even though they're responsible for it. It's a lot to ask.
I think strategy as a service on the CMMS side is a huge potential that no one will buy.
If that's the case,
meaning
you're going to get better outcomes.
CMMS company, I want to be able to analyze your data, tell you where you have quality problems, shoot you a ping that says people are doing things wrong. You might want to do retraining. Hey, I looked at your worst problem actors. You might want to replace these assets or check out their strategy. Like, I think there's just a ton of upside there. I also think most companies will decline that add-on.
I
They don't know
tend
what they
to
don't
agree.
know, and they don't unfortunately, the desire to invest in being better from a maintenance perspective is not at the level it needs to be.
Yeah, that reminds me of service when it comes to being a CMMS provider and what can I do after you've paid for your license. And, all of a sudden, we're just worried about getting to the next billing phase and getting that check in. I've often thought, and this is a huge ask, right? I've often thought that CMMS providers should have these things in place for their clientele, even if their clientele don't pay it. And if their clientele don't pay for it, then that means the CMMS provider's operating costs are going to go up. And we know at some point, and in certain situations, if not all, that is going to be a problem on the balance sheet when it comes to our spend as a CMMS provider, because we kind of willfully refuse to see the value of, we're going all the way back to the beginning of today, that long-term outcome that we really want, but we can't see the value quarter by quarter quite yet.
So I would say that 15 years ago, the operating cost would be significant because someone has to dig through the data.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have to create reports and somehow map them to everybody's data structure.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that in today's world, that's a good use for AI. If you can teach AI what poor data quality looks like on the CMMS side, and you can teach it, how to identify, when the company's doing rework because of these conditions. In that case, you could automate looking at everybody's information and giving you recommendations on which companies to contact. I think I should shut up because I have a good idea.
Well, yes, but I just this final closing point that you're onto something there, because what we're really looking for from our technology stacks, these solutions, and in this case, a CMMS as this database, and why do we have it, and what can it really do for us? It won't do for you what you don't do with it. And if it can be programmed, so instead of AI, we'll say you're going to use machine learning, which is what AI is, to create programmatic language that gives people clues. I've always said CMMS platforms will give you and your team and your leadership and your organization clues as to where you should be looking for potential problems, causation. It can give you a little bit of a clue where to go and look and say, hey, here I need to actually do deep dive root cause analysis to figure out why we're having this recurring failure. Is it going against the design intent of the machine? Is the operator running the wrong materials? The CMMS collects and gathers all that, and this conversation is going to continue, but we will stop talking about your brilliant idea. And if anybody out there steals it, just reach out to this man and say, thank you for the idea. George, as always, thank you for being on CMMS Radio.
Greg, always a pleasure. And I'm sure somebody is already running with that idea or have had it long before me. But thanks again for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. And I love what ReliabilityX is doing. I love the recent video on the new framework, and we'll do it again on the next one.
Awesome. Thank you.
You got it. Did you find this episode helpful? Please send us some feedback, suggest a topic, or ask a question. Reach out to CMMS Radio if you need a co-pilot on your CMMS project. Visit CMMSradio.com and use the What's on Your Mind link. Thank you for tuning in to CMMS Radio, your resource for all things CMMS, from selection to implementation, to help you make better choices, learn from industry experts, and have a successful CMMS journey.